Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this session, 2020, the Year of Behavioral Science and Social Relations, at this year's virtual Victoria Forum. I'm Mareike Schmeres. I'm a Vice President at the Busara Center, and I'll be your host, and I'm the champion of this session today. But before we delve into what this session will be about, and about the people you will hear from, I want to spend some time for the Territorial Acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples, on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasinach peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continues to this day. Also, many of us are meeting in this virtual space outside of Victoria, outside of British Columbia and across the world. And so I would also like to acknowledge the land on which you live and work. Again, thank you so much for joining us. A few very quick housekeeping things. Many of you might be Victoria Forum veterans by now, but I want to just remind you that the session is being recorded. We have about 90 minutes for our discussion. It's a roundtable discussion, so we really would like to hear from you. And the way that works, of course, in this forum is we would like to hear from you through the Q&A box. So please feel free to straight away start talking to us, because we would really like to weave your questions, your comments, your remarks, your reactions into the session from the very beginning, because it makes for a lively discussion. And this is an interesting, fascinating topic, and I'm sure that many of you have thoughts. Again, thank you for joining us. Before we start with this session, I want to take you back, or I want us all to go back to the very beginning of the pandemic. And I wonder whether you remember when you first heard about this viral pneumonia, and this viral pneumonia that then became what exactly? And I wonder whether you can remember the first time you changed something because of COVID-19, and whether you can remember what it was. What it was likely depends a lot on where you were at the time. Maybe you immediately stayed at home. Maybe you immediately started wearing a mask in public. Maybe schools around you closed straight away. Maybe any kind of public gathering was cancelled. Maybe even you were screened and quarantined straight away, or you couldn't travel. I was in the UK, so I spent the early days of coming to grips with COVID-19 seeing a lot of events and meetings cancelled, and I also spent a lot of early days time washing my hands while singing Happy Birthday twice. What is the one thing that none of us did? None of us took any medication that for sure could help against COVID. None of us got vaccinated. Obviously, none of this is available. The only thing we could all do was change behavior. And this is what we did. This is the only thing available at the moment against COVID, changing the way we interact, keeping away from each other, washing our hands, wearing a mask, not gathering. So really, that means that's a huge shift in behavior of a lot of people. And that makes it fair to say that 2020 truly is the year of behavioral science. But the contribution that behavioral science has made to the COVID response has been incredibly impactful and not without controversies. And I sometimes wonder whether the reason for this controversy is also because people don't necessarily clearly understand what behavioral science really is. But what is it? It depends a little bit who you ask, but a definition that I like is that it is the kind of knowledge and the insights that we need to have to understand the way humans act, the way humans make decisions, what influences these decisions and these actions. It's the kind of amalgamation of academic disciplines that are interested with exactly these questions. What is it that shapes human behavior in certain ways? And also maybe what are the obstacles that can stand in the way of good decision making? These obstacles can be manifold. They can be emotions. They can be our social environment, our political, our economic, even our physical environment. They can very much be the way we use and process information, and they can be in our relationships. And again, what a year it has been for our emotions and our relationships and our environments, and what a year it has been for behavioral science. And I think what this points us towards is also that there's now a real shift. We understand already the huge impact, the huge knowledge that behavioral science has brought to the COVID response. And we also recognize how much more knowledge need there is, just as we see how human behavior and the pandemic continue to interact with each other, shape each other even. But I think there's a little bit more. I think the fact that behavioral science was so important this year, continues to be important, points us toward the fact that we should pay attention to other ways of using behavioral science. And I guess this is a little bit of a new frontier, asking this question, what can behavioral science teach us about things where it's not usually applied? Global politics, issues of governance, really big international issues of social cohesion, or indeed, in spirit with the Victoria Forum, bridging social divides. What can behavioral science tell us about this? That's the frontier, and that's exactly the frontier that this session today is about. And I'm really delighted to have you join us, and I'm really delighted to have really 4 excellent speakers who will bring a lot of insights into this very debate. I will introduce the speakers as they go so that I don't rattle off 4 names to you. And I want to start straight away with Susan Michie. Susan Michie is Professor of Health Psychology at University College in London. She's also the Director of the Centre for Behaviour Change there. And Susan Michie has been busy in the last few months. In addition to leading 3 COVID-19 research projects, she's also an expert advisor on the UK's scientific pandemic influenza groups on behavioural science. And she's a consultant advisor to the World Health Organization on COVID-19 and behaviour. Welcome, Susan. We're delighted to have you. And I wonder whether you can talk us through about what you think happened in this relationship between behavioral science and a global pandemic, unlike any we've known before. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Marika, and it's a great honour to be here, and I'm looking forward to the next hour and a half of discussion with everyone. Well, I thought I'd start by saying something about where behaviour fits into all of this. As you said, it's been a unprecedented year in terms of the relationship between behavioural science and policy, for good, sometimes not always for good. But just as with the other great existential threat of the climate emergency, behaviour is at the heart of the problem. It's at the heart of the transmission, but it's also at the heart of the solution. So where does behaviour fit in? Well, obviously, there's a group of what we might call protective behaviours. Distancing from each other, covering our faces to stop cough and sneezing and aerosol transmission, hand and surface hygiene. And these are all very different, with different influences and different types of intervention that are needed. And this requires a scientific understanding of even these simple behaviours. But if we could get the whole population to adopt these at scale and long term, we could actually kill the pandemic dead in its tracks. So they're not to be underestimated. These are examples of small individual behaviours that could actually change a global pandemic. But that's the big if, how one could possibly do that. Then behaviour comes into another system, the find, test, trace, isolate and support system, which is our only way out of this pandemic outside of a vaccine, an effective vaccine. But behaviour is crucial here. The behaviour to get tested. I mean, in the UK, we know even now, only about 50% of people accurately know the 3 key symptoms of COVID-19. So people have to, first of all, get a test. Then, if they're found to be positive, they need to give their contacts so they can be traced. This requires a degree of trust and various other things. And then thirdly, they also need to isolate. Again, I am involved in a weekly survey in the UK. We know that only 20% of those people with symptoms are isolating themselves. And this has been the case for months. And we are commissioned by our Department of Health and Social Care. So our government knows it's been the case for months. And, you know, this is absolutely disastrous if we want to get out of the pandemic. It's a behavioural issue. When vaccination comes along, it's not going to be the silver bullet. It requires people to have it. It's a behaviour. It doesn't happen on its own. It's the behaviour of those who offer it, as well as the behaviour of those who accept it. Now, we can't really make progress unless we understand the nature of behaviour in its context. All these behaviours I've spoken about are very different than each other. But if, for example, I take this issue about only 20% of people isolating themselves if symptomatic, our government, the UK government, has slapped on a fine of £10,000 if you don't do this. Now, this is such a profound mistake and goes against what behavioural scientists have been advising government the whole way along, is that you enable, you support, you bring people together, you do not punish and divide people. And if you look at this particular behaviour, there's no difference across the income levels for intention, motivation to isolate. The difference comes in actually being able to do it. And the reasons people give for not being able to do it is they have jobs outside of their house. They need income to put food on the table. They have caring responsibilities outside of the house. They have to go out for provisions. So these are not motivational issues, yet the government is assuming it's motivation and then using even the wrong intervention type of punishment rather than support. So that's an example. And the very simplest comprehensive way of understanding behaviour is for any of these behaviours to occur, people need to have motivation. Yes, they do. But they also need to have the capability, the knowledge and the skills. And absolutely key, they need to have the physical and social opportunity to do the behaviour. And if only policymakers understood this very simple model and listened to behavioural scientists. And what is behavioural science? It's a whole body of evidence, it's theories and explanations, and it's methods of how to gather information and interpret information. So behavioural science is much more than about messaging and communication. It's about incentive structures, support within systems, use of the social and physical environment to support and change behaviour. So that's just something about where behaviour fits in. Moving on to how is behavioural science used? So how is the expertise translated into policy and practice? So we have, yes, direct advice to government, and I'm part of a brilliant group behavioural scientists across many disciplines: anthropology, sociology, communications expertise, implementation expertise. Probably about 30 to 40 of us who do enormous amounts of the evenings and weekends to produce excellent papers that are published on our government website in the end. But we're part of a labyrinthine structure within government of the Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies. We're only one of several subcommittees. It goes to that committee. Then who knows what other committees go to? We have no idea about how much of what we say and advise ends up anywhere near those people in government taking decisions. So I think it's really important not to just rely on the official influence or official channels of potential influence to government. I'm also on something that's called Independent Sage that was set up by a previous chief scientific advisor to government because he thought there should be more transparency and openness in advice, in discussion. And so we have weekly 1 to 1.5 hour sessions interacting with the press and with the public. And we produce many different reports. We have a website. If you look up Independent Sage, you'll find that. If I had to guess, I would think probably we had more impact than my other hat on. And then also there's engagement with press and broadcasting, which I do most days. I think it's really important to use these channels, and indeed social media and community events, getting involved with communities in terms of listening and thinking together. I would say that behavioural science has also been sometimes misunderstood and misused, I think sometimes with motivation. Certainly in the UK, something called behavioural fatigue suddenly popped up in the narrative. Now, there isn't such a thing in behavioural science. There's not such a measure. There's not such a term. It's not used in any theory. I think it was a mishmash of different things. And it was kind of obliquely used to justify delaying the initial lockdown. And many of us kind of protested against this use of this word. And we didn't hear anything about it for months until the next lockdown came along and suddenly it reared its head again. And so the whole idea of people being fragile, fatigued, is not borne out by the evidence when you look at it. Yes, people are fed up. But what we know is people will go to great sacrifices in terms of changing their behaviour. If they know, if they're concerned, if they know there's a great risk, if they know that what they're doing can make a difference, if they trust the leadership of the people who are asking them to make these sacrifices, and if there's a sense of collective solidarity that's built up, these are all really important influences. And what we've found through this pandemic is that people and communities, despite everything, have a resilience and incredible acts of generosity and mutual aid that we've seen. And this is part of behavioural science and understanding what's going on. And I just want to end on the note of what behavioural science can say in terms of government leadership, and what, the government hat that I've had and the independent sage hat, we've said many, many times, the importance of trusted leadership, which means direct, honest and open communication. It means consistent and coherent explanations, not only of what you should do, but why you should do it. It means understanding all of communities, especially those who are disadvantaged and most challenged in terms of being able often to adhere because of their circumstances to some of the restrictions, and suffering the most when they do so. And what's really important is perceived fairness. And unfortunately, in the UK, quite a lot of the policies have not been fair. And this is divisive and undermines that sense of collective solidarity. And we have asked all along that the government should engage with communities, should really listen to communities, should be regarding them as a source of understanding and of solutions to problems, and take a partnership approach. It hasn't happened yet. We're not giving up in terms of giving that message. So that's a perspective on behavioural science, very much from a UK point of view. But I'm really looking forward to hearing what the other speakers have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, Mickey. And what it's fascinating to me already, I mean, this is the point of the session today, to take the way you speak about behavioral science in the public health space and take it into the political space. And we'll get to that in a second, just how incredibly big the overlap is between the existing concepts. And yet this is a conversation that rarely happens, except here today. So it's very exciting. But I want to go first to Nila Saldana. Before I ask you a question, Nila, I'll give a brief introduction. So Nila was the founding director at the Center for Social and Behavior Change at Ashoka University. But Nila comes from a very different background in the private sector, and she also has a PhD in marketing and an MBA, and uses both of these and these many different perspectives to really try and take cutting-edge academic research and put it into practicality. Operationalize is the secret word that always comes to mind when the issue comes to translating academic research to concrete policy recommendations. Nila, wonderful to have you. And I wonder, Susan talked a lot about the need to know more and also to understand really how different communities experience this current situation differently and what the impact is. We heard about motivation versus a behavioral issue. I wonder what your thoughts are on this. What are we missing at the moment in our knowledge and our understanding?
Thanks, Marika. This is really great. And, Susan set up things so perfectly. I was taking furious notes because so many of the themes are echoed in what I'd like to ask and to push for. So, I had the great good fortune of setting up the center in India, and that taught me a lot about the global south, quote unquote, where anywhere from 80 to 90% of the world's population actually lives. And I think, a couple of questions that I want to actually throw to push the foundations of behavior science. The first one is, what problems are we actually solving? So very recently, we put out a call with behavior scientists in the Global South to write short pieces about what they thought were the challenges of COVID-19. And we were expecting a lot around the challenges of the behavior, social distancing, mask wearing. We got some of that. But what was so surprising to me was that the problems that COVID threw up were not just health problems. There were issues of how do we report, how do we, we have a mental health issue. People are reporting very poor mental health. What can we do? Gender violence, how do, women were not reporting gender violence. And trust, Susan mentioned trust in government and authorities. And one outcome of a lack of trust is a reversion to traditional gender roles. So this has implications not just for trust in, health information, but for the fabric of your society. And then there was a very interesting idea that even the behaviors that we're trying to encourage, like social distancing, may actually go against fundamental identities. So one of the behavioral scientists, Rochelle Jacobs in South Africa, wrote about the concept of Ubuntu, which is, I am because we are. So this fundamental notion that our identity is collective. And now you're asking people to perform a behavior that's not in line with their, cultural and social identity. So I think that the first question was, what problems are we actually solving when we go in and we jump into designing an intervention? And I think COVID-19 has brought that out. The second one is, and I think Susan talked about it a little bit, is how are we solving that problem? So we've done a lot of work, especially in the global north, in the UK, US, Europe, etc., Canada, to talk about choice architecture, right? About behavioral economics, about nudges we could use, and that's great. But we also need to focus on what Susan called the capability, the motivation, the environment. And just coming from my marketing background, unless we understand people's goals, unless we understand their identity and how they signal this identity by making choices, unless we understand what rituals they are currently performing to control for uncertainty, what we're then imposing on them is as much magical thinking as we think that they're currently doing in their environment. Why should anyone listen to me if what you're telling me is completely alien to what I've been doing and what seems to work for me in my context? So I think we have a lot to learn from other disciplines who've done this. I mean, mine is marketing, but where brands are used as identity signalers all the time. What's the equivalent choices that people make that signal their identity? And Susan talked about this idea of collective solidarity, right? And this idea of fairness. And when we think about goals, it's not just transactional goals, it's the goals of things like dignity. We all want our dignity to be acknowledged and respected. We want things to be fair. And also we need to check and see what are our interventions doing to people in terms of time poverty and therefore their well-being. So the second issue is, how are we solving? Are we solving a small part of the problem? Or are we actually solving, for people's goals and giving them a sense of identity and feeding into their rituals? And the third piece, I think, based on my experience, is how do we make this solution sustainable? And I'm so glad, actually, the behavior change wheel does have a layer of fiscal and regulatory and marketing and communications, because a big problem that I saw when we were at the center and we were trying to work with governments to get a lot of this behavior in, is we didn't think hard enough about how do we embed this in the fiscal environment, in the regulatory environment, as part of a coordinated marketing campaign. So you have different NGOs, foundations, civil society people, academics coming in with their own intervention. And poof, in 6 months, that intervention shows some results and then it goes away. And then we start all over again. So, how do we make it much more sustainable? So I think these three questions: what problems are we solving? How are we solving these problems? And how do we make the solutions more sustainable? And I think the common thread to all of this is context. So I've been back in the US for about a year now. And even then I'm losing touch with, I think, what's happening in India or what the contextual urgencies are. So I can't stress enough, I think, the need for us to move towards the global south if we want to be able to have any chance of solving these problems and really embed ourselves in the context there.
Thank you, Nila. I wonder, Susan, whether I can ask you for a quick reaction, because a couple of things I find really fascinating. So in a way, Nila has opened up the bigger complexity, right? So we now go from fighting the pandemic to actually seeing the pandemic as a complex problem that has also emerged in the way it has emerged because of the structures it encountered. Nila talked about identity, with this idea that actually different identities experience the pandemic very differently. And I wonder, Susan, whether you can take us back into the more kind of medically focused world of behavioral science and talk us through how these complex interactions between structures, identity, people's personal experience, on top of the public health issue, how are they discussed in the advisory groups that you're part of? How is this complexity tackled?
Well, I wouldn't say that behavioural science is medically focused. We spend a lot of time trying to be an alternative to a medical way of looking at things. But I think the things that Nila said, I really resonate with. And I think I would sum it up as start from where people are, start from who they are, where they are, what the lived experience of them is. So Nila said, what are their goals? What are their identities? What are their rituals? How do we, preserve their dignity in terms of any of the changes we want to happen in terms of reducing transmission and this pandemic? And I think a lot of the things that Nila said are reflected in our work from that point of view. I think this is a message in all our different. We're asked about many different questions. Unfortunately, we're reactive. We can't set our own agendas and say what we think are important. And often the policy decisions that the government are taking are not what we've been asked about. But all the questions we ask about, we really bring up these themes that you have to start from understanding. Behaviours exist in people. People exist in relationships. Relationships exist in the material circumstances which shapes and supports and develops them. And unless you understand that complexity, then you're really missing the picture that you need to deal with. So I think one of the arts of, and when I say behavioural science, I'm talking about it in the broader sense that brings in so many different disciplines, from engineering to anthropology. It is being able to deal with the complexity of the big picture at the same time as being able to drill down into the details and the granularity of the specific behaviours in their specific context, which is place as well as time, which is part of the flow of behaviour. These are not things that happen in isolation. They happen as part of a bigger flow. So anyway, if that's enough of at this moment, a reflection, I totally agree with these points. I think they're great.
Thank you, Susan. I want to go to Jonathan Popalitis. Jonathan Popalitis is World Vision's executive advisor on fragile states. He's working with governments on improving, for example, international engagement in situations of fragility. And before that, Jonathan served with the United Nations in Haiti, Indonesia, Liberia, and on the Iraq response. And Jonathan, I'm so curious to hear what you have to say, because there were a lot of terms in there that are being used in the space of international engagement, and yet they're hardly ever framed through this behavioral understanding that ultimately even high-level political engagement is about people. It's not politics that engage with each other. It's people that engage with each other. It's people who maybe even in the broad global political international space come with their political rituals. We've heard about rituals before. It's people who bring their own fragility, but also their own resilience to really big political undertakings. And I wonder whether you can talk us through, from your perspective as executive advisor on fragile states, how actually this way of looking at some of these challenges in political engagements might help and move that debate along. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Marika. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I've already enjoyed so much of the comments. Let me set the stage a little bit in terms of getting our heads around this international engagement. Earlier, a few months ago, the UN Security Council asked Mark Lowcock, who is the Chief of Humanitarian Affairs at the UN, where are we seeing the worst impacts of COVID-19 globally? And Lowcock's response was, beyond a reasonable doubt, the most impacted places in the world are the so-called fragile states or fragile contexts, of which the OECD lists 58 countries this year. And Mark said, it's not just the pandemic having a direct health impact, it's how it's knocking into existing crises in these really fragile places and creating increased risks of famine and food insecurity, a conflict and instability, forced displacement, and actually creating prospects for increased child mortality because of other health crises that are increasingly difficult to try to manage in these already challenged contexts. And this brings up, I think, some of the points that we're making in terms of what are the models of global engagement to really support these places, not just during the pandemic, but beyond. Now, even before COVID, a staggering 80% of the world's extreme poor have been estimated to be living in these fragile states by 2030, the end of the SDGs. So in many ways, these are the center of the global development crises. And the response that we've been trying to implement over the last few decades has really been this sort of good governance paradigm, which is very technocratic in its orientation and almost trying to make sort of Somalia into Denmark. In other words, trying to introduce Western-like institutions and economic policies, but without really engaging the politics, the social systems, the culture, the economy, all the pieces that the behavioral science tries to really elevate and understand in really rich ways. And so the question then becomes, how do we move forward? Now, over the last few years, we've seen the emergence of a new developmental paradigm, still in the works, but named, in terms of shorthand, the fragility to resilience paradigm. And in the OECD's flagship report this year called States of Fragility, it talks about how this new paradigm is gaining momentum. The report also talks about the influence of COVID on some of this thinking. And it notes that the World Bank, the European Union, the United States, and other donors and institutions are getting behind this paradigm. Now, central to this paradigm, I think, is what we've kind of been hearing in terms of what's important to look at. The first part is understanding the problem. What are the complex interacting risks of epidemics and pandemics and conflict and climate change and extreme poverty, and how are they interacting in complex ways and disrupting development in these places, which were already at really low starting points? And then how do we find our way to try and strengthen societal coping capacities, state capacities, and system capacities to try and address not only the risks that these places are producing, but get at some of the root cause issues, often political, and then try to better manage the ensuing crises. Now, this is really where we start to put center in front the topic of today, which is looking at social relations and behavioral science, because the increasing evidence in the fragility practice, the sector, points to a concept called social capital as one of the key drivers of resilience. And social capital refers to the norms and networks of cooperation, which are very uneven in these places, often very strained, but they exist. And the question is, how do you build them? The template of social capital says that where you can strengthen the bonds within communities, where you can strengthen bridges between communities that are disconnected economically, socially, and where they're sometimes divided politically and in conflict, and where you can strengthen the links between government systems and institutions and the services they provide to populations, the safety nets and cash transfers they provide, the information access. When you can do the bonding and bridging and linking together, then you really get a lift in resilience. Now, talked about in this way, about social capital, it's always meant to be more of an organizing framework, not a specific sector or discipline. It's meant to bring in political economy analysis, peace building, and conflict resolution when we talk about bridging, specific sector expertise in health and education, water sanitation, a gender lens to really understand gender violence, as Nila was talking about. And what's been conspicuously absent of this discussion so far is really bringing behavioral science into this, despite the fact that behavioral science has an outsized offering here in the sense of really understanding how individuals and communities internalize risk and loss, how they mobilize for collaboration and collective action, how they deal with conflict, how we deal with the mobility and the ability and the environment in which they work. And so I think moving forward, it becomes really important to take the recognition of behavioral science and its importance to addressing COVID-19 and apply it to this emerging paradigm so that it becomes a boilerplate, a key aspect of what we're trying to do in new ways of working to help the world's most vulnerable and to help these states as well.
Thank you, Jonathan. Once it's laid out in this way, it seems the oversight of connecting these debates and these strands of approaches is obvious, it's blatant, and yet it's really a very fledgling approach. So it's fascinating to hear about this more. It still, I think, for many people remains as a slightly abstract idea, that even high-level politics or kind of big political approaches to things like the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, would benefit from a behavioral science lens. And I want to bring Salim Kombo in the conversation to help us to unpack some of this, what might seem as quite an abstract set of concepts to apply in the big political space. Salim is an associate with the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. He previously worked with the Japan Overseas Cooperative Association, the African Union Commission, and with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Kenya, amongst others. And Salim, I wonder whether you can help us using some of these behavioral concepts that we've heard primarily from Susan and Nila and putting them into the space of politics firmly. Give us some help of how we might do this. How could we think about this?
Sure. Thanks so much, Marika. And maybe the best place to probably start is just try to get a better understanding of international relations and kind of what it means and the application that behavioral science and the contribution that it can make there. And firstly, the most important thing to acknowledge about international relations is that at its heart, international relations is the study of behavior of international actors. And there are several schools of international relations that exist out there, and the most prominent one being the realist school of international relations, which basically posits that states are self-interested and they're always going to behave in a rational manner, always going to look out for themselves above everything else. But the evidence, obviously, that we have from the practical application, from what we've seen in our daily interactions in the international system, is that there's definitely evidence to the contrary. States don't always behave in a rational or in this realist way. And kind of trying to understand why this is the case has really brought to attention a lot of the insights that behavioral science has to make in terms of understanding the process of human decision making, trying to understand developments that have happened around concepts around like bounded rationality and identification of different heuristics and biases have been applied very successfully to different fields like economics, where we've had like a whole other subfield of economics, which we call behavioral economics. And likewise, these concepts have also been applied to international relations. And we've had the development of behavioral international relations, which sadly has not been as successful or as prominent as behavioral economics. But it's really been aimed at trying to apply different insights from behavioral science, like personality psychology, cognitive decision-making, and also different insights from the field of sociology as well. But the world that we are currently in today, and Jonathan really laid a very good groundwork for this in terms of like how the world is shifting. It is also presenting opportunities for us to apply behavioral science in different ways in the field of international relations, especially when we remember that we are in a global pandemic, which is extremely unprecedented in terms of its scale and its economic and political impacts. We are also in a phase in geopolitical history where we are moving towards a multipolar world, which is inherently more unstable, and there's increased risk for conflict as we shift towards this. And then there's also the growing influence of non-state actors as well. So we have in some places, in some fragile contexts, where you have companies and also, for instance, terrorist groups, which actually have more power and influence than states themselves. And then also we have the global developments that are going on with demographic changes as well. So we have rapid increase in population in the global south, while we have declining populations in other places. And also there's a constant specter of climate change around the corner and the impacts that that's going to have. So with all this in mind, there are still, when we think about the potential impact that or positive areas that behavioral science can contribute to, I really think that there are four that stand out quite significantly. And the first is conducting research with non-weird populations. And this is something that Nila alluded to earlier. And it's basically the acronym WEIRD stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich and Developed. Democratic, sorry, not developed. And this is a phrase that was developed by Heinrich and Hein, and it summarizes one of the key challenges in behavioral science, and that is that 80% of the study participants in behavioral science research are from this kind of population, but they only comprise 12% of the world's population. So there's definitely need to conduct more research with non-weird populations so that we don't have this external validity crisis where there are challenges trying to apply research that has been done with Harvard undergraduates to a farmer in rural Tanzania. And in a lot of these cases, there are a lot of challenges around that. There's also more research that needs to be done when it comes to understanding values, and Nila hinted on this as well. So, for instance, when we think about one of the most prominent theories that's emerged recently around trying to understand moral foundations theory, which is a theory developed by Jonathan Haidt, and it basically aims to develop identify the universal fundamentals of ethics. And this obviously has very significant implications when it comes to decision making and also social consensus and building of social trust and whatnot. But again, a lot of this research is being done with non-weird populations. So more research is definitely needed there. And as we shift towards this multipolar world, there's more research that needs to be done to understand the beliefs, the values, the ethical principles, and kind of the concepts of fairness and what it takes to build a social contract in fragile contexts, which Jonathan has done a lot of research on as well. So when we think about principles like Ubuntu, which Nila mentioned, these are concepts that are going to become much more prevalent as we move towards a multipolar world. The second area of whether could be a lot of potential for behavioral science to contribute in international relations is understanding decision-making in contexts where institutions are weak. And this is something that behavioral science has a lot to contribute through, especially with the vast amount of research that already exists on behavioral science and organizational decision-making. So just to paraphrase Barack Obama, when he visited Ghana, when he was still president, one of the things that he said is Africa needs strong institutions and not strong men. But the reality is that we have very strong men and we don't have strong institutions. And that applies to many parts of the developing world. And what that means essentially is you're losing one of the key benefits of strong institutions, and that is the ability to serve as a check and a balance on foreign policy decision-making, the ability to understand the consequences of actions, and also to elevate the best options to make sure that optimal decisions are being made. But instead, when you have situations where decisions are being made by the few, these people who are making the decisions are subject to their own beliefs, their own biases, their own heuristics, which eventually end up in poor decision-making. So this is an area of potential interest for behavioral science research.
I wonder, actually, Salim, whether I could quickly throw a ball to Jonathan, because I wonder whether, Jonathan, you could take what Salim has just said and take us into a world of fantasy. What would it look like if all of a sudden the world in which you operate, where international actors seek engagement on development issues and so on in country, and that often runs into problems because of some of the points that Salim has outlined. But what would it look like if behavioral science and insight and behavioral understanding would become an inherent part of understanding context? Context specific is a great magic word in the world of international development engagement. But what would it look like if you took some of Salim's ideas and actually applied them in the context that you work in?
So let me give perhaps one of my favorite examples, and it's from work that Busara Center has done with the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium in Uganda, looking at mental landscapes, mental models. And one of the findings was that when people in post-conflict situations think about the conflict before they engage in economic games, in this case, as a way of testing, they become more collaborative and altruistic versus times when they're not thinking about the conflict, when they're just thinking about their own immediate gain. And this is fascinating both from a micro standpoint in terms of how you might be able to do some of the bonding and bridging work that I mentioned, but it's also fascinating in the sense of the implications at a much bigger scale in terms of the country level. Sarah Phillips just did a book about Somaliland and how it's been able to hold together without a lot of international support and neighboring conflict everywhere. And the finding that she has that's really interesting is that it's the narrative that the state tells society about conflict. The region's always on the verge of conflict, so we have to stick together. We have to be bound together. We have to make sacrifices for the collective. And you see there that this idea of when you're prompted to think about conflict, you might become more collaborative and altruistic, playing out at a much bigger scale in terms of Somaliland. It becomes even more interesting when you look at the tweet of the recently former Prime Minister of Somalia, who tweeted, I think last year, that one of his biggest challenges in the recovery process in the country was finding the right narrative to bring together society within the political settlement and the social foundation. So you have these applications. Now, connected to sort of what Salim is talking about, we don't have currently a really center of gravity in these fragile places as an aid community that we work in, where we can take insights like that and work together to then think about how do we then leverage those insights collectively and move forward. What you have oftentimes, and you've had for a long time in these places, is a sea of sort of separate, disjointed projects, short-term, one-off, and not a lot of collective action. Now, saying that, for the last 20 years, there have been experiments to try and create these so-called country platforms where you bring government together with representatives of the community and civil society and donors and implementing partners, and you try to come up with a collective idea of where you're going at both a very high level and at a technical level. And I think this is a really interesting place for then trying to figure out how do we make these country platforms work better. There is increasing evidence in Somalia that it was the platform in that country over the last few years that made a huge difference in how well it's been able to move from being a chronic humanitarian emergency to a fragile state building project. And so this will require changes in mindsets from the various states, kind of getting past some of the weird orientation that Salim was talking about, and getting really grounded in the context in a way that can solve collective action problems and promote collective understanding of the situation. And when you can then have that kind of platform in place that brings the global aid community together with really key stakeholders beyond just the government, then you have a place for doing this behavioral work and bringing it into this process. And I was, I had solidarity with Susan's comment about they're making a lot of recommendations within this specialized committee, but they have no idea then where it goes. And so the same dynamic plays out in the fragile places, but these country platforms, which I should say the World Bank has now committed to supporting 11 pilots for, this could be a real place for being able to properly use this information at a much more scalable level.
And Marika, I don't know if I can jump in.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to, because this whole thing about what both what Salim and Jonathan said about the narrative is so critical. And I thought maybe I'll sort of concretize it with just a couple of thoughts. So I was very struck by this idea that Jonathan had about good governance, right? And good governance is a narrative. It's not an absolute reality. And the reason I say that is because we often think good governance is about lower corruption, for example. But if you go to a place like India and you ask people about, good governance, they will sometimes give you examples of leaders who they think are really good governance. And you say, but they're really corrupt. And they've taken all these bribes and so on. And so this notion that corruption and good governance, and people say, but they've done a lot for the poor. They've done a lot of benefits, a lot of welfare schemes. I'm better off. So who cares how much money they have made, right? I am better off. So this notion that corruption and good governance are antithetical may not hold, and it's a different narrative, and we need to understand where people are coming from. And I just want to say that another concrete example in the same vein is this weekend is actually the Diwali Festival. So it's the biggest festival for Hindus, billion plus population. One of the hallmarks of Diwali is that you give everybody presents. You give them sweets, right? Or sometimes other presents. And that's not related only to your friends and families. So you will give it to suppliers, you will give it to people and so on. It's just the cultural norm. And not to give something would be seen as very ungenerous and mean and selfish. So it's a collective spirit. Now, you tell government servants, government officials that they can't receive any gifts, but they get these sweets which are in the culture. Is that corruption? They may not even think about that narrative as being. So I think that this idea that good governance and some of these terms that we use, and we're so clear about it, come from our assumption of being in a Western, industrialized, rich, democratic environment. And so that's why we need to sort of be in that environment and understand what people's interpretation is of that environment, if we have to say what are strong institutions and what are weak institutions.
One thing that's really striking to me in the conversation is that there are these concepts that come up sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, which is things about trust. Susan started us off on that, fairness, dignity, the relationship that actual individuals have with their government, which are so crucial at this point in time. We have a question here about just how damaging this kind of punishing approach that also, Susan, you mentioned, might be to how willing people are to change their behavior. And again, this is fascinating for me to bring these two conversations together, because I wonder, Susan, whether some of what you've heard from Salim and from Nila and from Jonathan, how does that resonate with your recent experience of just seeing trust break apart in government responses? And if you could roll back, what would you like to apply from maybe some of these ideas of fairness and dignity that we've heard in how the response has played out against COVID in the past few months in the UK?
Well, there's so much to pick up on what people have been saying. But one of the things I think is, do as I do, not as I say. So there's been a big difference between what people have said and what they do. And that's very damaging in terms of trust. So, if one had to roll back, would be to really prevent a lot of the things that have happened. I know not only in the UK, but other countries where the leaders are saying one thing, but they've been caught doing other things. And this is incredibly undermining because it means this doesn't matter so much. That's the kind of subtext, but also one rule for you and one rule for us, which is very divisive and very undermining. Because at the beginning, our government tried to get this sort of, we're all in this together. And somebody used the analogy of, yes, we're in the same storm, but we're in different boats. So there's only so far you can take this. We are all in this together. And I think a very stark example of this is that we, like probably many other countries, had tragically high levels of deaths amongst healthcare professionals. They were inadequately protected from PPE. And one of the things that was a very good collective solidarity thing that we did, and I know other countries did it, every week on a certain day, we came up onto our doorsteps and we clapped for our health service workers. And it was very unifying. Neighbours got together to sort of know each other, etc. But at the same time, the government refused any wage increase for those same workers. They talked about giving them a badge, and there was huge anger. We don't want your claps. We don't want your badges. We are struggling to survive in terms of the low wages we're on. So that's kind of a particular example. But one of the words I'd really like to pick up on that Salim used is the word values. I just don't think we talk about values enough, because values is really at the heart of how different governments have responded to this crisis that many weren't prepared for. And what do we mean by values? There's many different things, but a very important part of anybody's value system is to do with equality and equity versus inequality. To what extent do we think things should be fairer? To what extent should things be more equal in society? Now, what's happened is that many, many societies are hugely unequal to begin with all the mental and physical and economic adverse effects that has. But then the pandemic came along, and we know that virus made things more unequal just by the nature of some communities being more vulnerable, the most deprived people being in the most crowded housing, in the most public-facing jobs. And so there's a whole layer of inequality that was added on top of that, just by the nature of the virus. But then on top of that, you've had government policies that have then given a whole new layer, often, of, not in all countries, but I will speak definitely for my own, of increased inequalities, looking after people in salaried jobs more than precarious incomes, looking after people who have mortgages rather than people who are renting their houses. And so it goes on. And so I think that this issue of value system is really at the heart, because you can't have, yes, we built up a sense of collective solidarity at the beginning, because at the beginning of crises, evidence shows that people want strong leadership. They're very forgiving. They'll all rally around. But then it gets undermined and chipped away. And you can't have collective solidarity in an objectively, economically, very, very divided society. It's just not going to happen. And finally, on this issue, I suppose values, then, sets of values are associated with ideology. And to what extent have different governments used the public sector and the public infrastructure that's already in existence? And to what extent have they gone to see this as a new market for the private sector and for commercialisation? So in the UK, our government, instead of using our public health infrastructure for the test, trace and isolate system, spent £120 billion, not million, £1 billion on commercial contracts of large organisations, large companies that didn't have experience or expertise, weren't trusted by the population, and have set up a system that has totally failed, despite all the public health experts saying you need to go local, you need to keep this amongst the people who know the communities, trusted by the communities. So why did that happen? You can't get away from the issue of values and ideology there.
I want to go back to Salim on this, actually. Salim, if you were to imagine if there was a moment in which behavioral scientists, public health experts, international agencies and national governments came together to kind of create a joint narrative on what would be a helpful international engagement in a particular country. If you had such a moment and wanted it to be informed by the values that you stressed, that Susan stressed, what would that even look like? How could these encounters between international organizations, national governments, and so on, how could they become aware of their values, and what could be a push towards maybe even a shared narrative on shared values? Speculate, come up with some ideas. It'd be very interesting to know what that could look like.
Sure, Marika. So I think probably the biggest challenge that we have to actually achieving that at the moment is that there isn't actually equity or equality in the international system in terms of representation or access to opportunities for all countries to be able to be listened to equally and have an equal voice at the table. And that's, I think, the core of the issues with the United Nations Security Council at the moment, and all the efforts that are trying to happen there in terms of trying to reform it to be more representative of what the world is today and not what it was in 1945. But the structure of this international system as it is, it really does favor the entrenched. It favors those who built the system. And there just isn't another way for the rest of the world to have an equal say at the table. So really what it would take is kind of an international order where everybody comes to the table as equals. And the chances of that happening are sadly quite small, and especially since we all live in a realist world where they still dominate in terms of the theories and ideologies and perspective of how the international system should function. But potentially what it could take, since we're just speculating here, is possibly a challenge that's so big and so great that it requires everybody to contribute, where we can't have a freeloader effect and we can't have one or a few states that are too powerful to override everything. So we hope the pandemic would be it, but doesn't seem likely. So maybe it might take something bigger than a pandemic for that to happen. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but sadly quite pessimistic.
Well, but I wonder whether they're... Sorry. Yes, Jonathan, go ahead.
I would love to just say something in response as well. I think Susan's point right at the end about how values are actually connected to ideologies in many ways is really important. And it brings up for me the work of the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium that you are the research director for. Because there was a finding over the 9 years of research done in many fragile states that in some cases where there was a fair distribution of services, then there was more legitimacy seen for the state from the population. But in other cases, fairness was not part of the criteria, nor was the outcome. So whether the people all got something fairly or not, and whether they actually got something at all, didn't seem to matter in some cases, which produced sort of the guiding riddle, right, of the SRSC. And what we've been kind of puzzling through this work is that the role of narrative, the role of how narrative connects to people's lived experience within where they sit in the kind of like the hierarchy in the society, the political settlement, and the kind of services they get all combine in really fascinating ways to construct legitimacy. It's not just about getting a fair transaction of services for legitimacy, for example. And I'm struck as well that, Nila mentioned before about the cases in India. We've seen in India, as well as places like Sierra Leone, that in villages where there was more fair distribution, there were more ruling families that were able to have political competition and then give to their constituencies, there was better outcomes. But in places where there were less competition and more sort of ruling elites, families or chieftains, they were actually seen as more legitimate, even though the amount of services that they were getting was dramatically less. And the World Development Report on 2015 about mind and development really goes into this idea that it's perhaps because of the way the relationship, the behavior has been formed, and the mental model that naturalizes the way people experience the world. And so it becomes a mental model that then it becomes whether or not it's legitimate or not in terms of the narrative, the experience coming together. So I just want to bring up those points because I think they're important as riddles for the future too.
Yeah. And I just want to add to what Jonathan said, because I think when we think about values, we tend to think about equality, equity, fairness. But if you actually think about, and even what Sunny mentioned in moral foundations, you have values like sanctity or purity, and you have values around authority and the respect of traditions. And that's actually the expansion, right? Which is this idea that in many societies, and in all societies, there's a need to preserve order as well as to harness the individual liberty of people. Now, if you think about values like those, and if we actually do a participatory dialogue with people and they say, actually, we don't want individual liberty and we want to preserve the tradition and the sanctity, then what do we do? So I think we need to get to the messy business of how people construct value, what their values are, and how we work with those values to strive for a more just and fair world, knowing that sometimes some of those values may actually, may be difficult to reconcile with what we want. If there is a value that, you preserve the sanctity by following traditions around menstruation for women, how do we change that? It is a very deeply held value in that community. So I think that I completely agree with what Jonathan said, that we need to understand how people frame things, how they construct the narrative, and what that value is that's driving their perception of the outcome. And it's messy. It's messy.
There's always also the interesting tension between process versus outcome. I guess a pandemic, by definition, has really focused attention on the outcome, which is beating the pandemic, trying to get into place things that make sure that the pandemic ends. The process part is really interesting, right? Because we've touched upon it throughout this conversation, that there might also be very useful ways for behavioral science to contribute to making the politics that surrounds all of this almost kinder, like the process engagement. Again, Susan mentioned this how damaging the punishment approach can be, the alienation that a lot of people experience because they are effectively excluded from any of the political negotiations, the importance of dignity and so on. And I wonder whether any of you have any thoughts on what would it look like if we shifted the contribution of behavioral science to creating in a way, a political process, a way of politically engaging that feels better to people, that feels kinder to people, that maybe shifts the tone and ultimately becomes a lot more constructive. Is there such a thing?
Well, I think one thing is often people think about politics in terms of government policies, but politics is really about populations and what's going on in populations. And I think there's been a lot of really, obviously, terrible things that have happened as a result of the pandemic. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of some of the positives. And I think people connecting with communities, I think, is one of the things that has happened. Now, it's very difficult to talk about in any general sense, because, I know most about the UK, I know a bit about Europe. I know little bits and pieces of other countries that I've heard about. So I don't want to talk on behalf of other countries. But certainly in the UK, I think it's really brought out a sense of people looking after each other, of kind of a bit of energy and a bit of empowerment there in communities. It's happening alongside people losing their jobs, people being scared of losing their houses, people's incomes going, people's futures going. So it's a very odd tension where, on the one hand, there's, real desperation. But on the other hand, there has been this strength of community. And I think that another issue that's happened in the UK, many more people working at home. And previously in the cities, people were traveling 1-2 hours a day in and out of jobs when they didn't actually have to be in those workplaces. Bad for physical health, bad for mental health, bad for the environment. And the idea that actually one could be more in one's communities, because a lot of those communities have become kind of ribbon communities. They've lost their heart and their soul. They've really been kind of neglected by the governments. in a way, if we could get more people who were working locally, buying locally, that would be a way, I think, of regenerating communities and community spirit. And there could be more of a bottom-up regeneration of politics, rather than populations kind of either perceiving things to be fair or unfair, is people hopefully becoming more connected and more empowered. But as I said, that's going alongside the other scenario of people losing jobs, houses, futures, etc., which really, in many cases, undermines that kind of energy.
And I think there are interesting ideas, sorry to jump in, interesting ideas around, that behavioral science has been working with in order to sort of get to this fairness of process. So I can think about the tax voucher, where people are given a choice, are allowed a choice with a little bit of their taxes as to where it should go. And even, I think this is work done by Kate Lamberton at Wharton, and they find that there's a huge increase in tax satisfaction with paying taxes. So you can see how people feel the process is fair if their voice. I was talking to someone recently, and they said they found that the completion rates on their research were much higher if they spent time upfront explaining what the research was about to people, even if it took longer. So classic behavioral science would tell us, make it easy, make it short. But actually they found spending the time upfront to talk to people and explain the research, give them a sense of being invested and engaged, and then they would actually complete the research. So I think we see little green shoots. Another interesting idea is sludge removal and accessing government services. There's an interesting NGO in India that, helps citizens to actually just collect welfare benefits that the government has set aside, and that would increase perceptions of good governance. So I think we're seeing green shoots of this. What we need to do, I think you're completely right, is to focus not just on outcomes, but also how can we use some of this understanding of psychology, understanding of the perceptions of fairness to actually make the process better, not just, the outcomes that we're talking about.
Salim, I wonder whether this gives you hope in some way or another, whether there are some of these, I don't like the term particularly, but it describes adequately what is meant. But some of these ideas of using bottom-up value creation, being more locally engaged, being community-driven, is there a possibility to really change, using some behavioral insights to change those mechanisms and then change some of the broader, more international engagement? How do these things, how could they connect?
I think they're definitely absolutely necessary, especially when we think about how, for instance, approaches to behavior change actually taking place in places like the Global South, where we can talk about behavioral fatigue in the North, but there isn't any applications of behavioral science that really at a mass scale that's taking place effectively in the South. So you have a situation where you have countries that behavior changes through the bullet. Because they just don't have the toolkit to be able to have more sophisticated or nuanced ways of giving incentives to the population. So the only way that they know how to do this is through violence. So, for instance, like the country I come from, Kenya, there was a point where more people had actually been killed by the police enforcing the COVID-19 restrictions and had actually died from the virus. And really, there is like a definite need for it to happen, and in that sense, I am optimistic in terms of like the behavior revolution definitely getting to the South, and through the work of initiatives like the work that Nila is doing and Busara as well, and Jonathan too. Like this, it'll definitely come to the South, and the impacts they can have there are going to be quite significant.
If I may, so what's interesting to me about this idea of social capital that I mentioned was that it's trying to play a role of connecting formal institutions and policies with communities for efforts of sort of bonding and strengthening their own sort of self-help, and then bridging divided communities. And so it really gives you a template for thinking about not only the communal types of efforts you need to strengthen, but the connectivity that exists both in terms of institutions, but also politics. And the way I've been thinking about it as we've been talking is been thinking about Susan's behavior change wheel that she's done. You can Google it. It's a really lovely way of thinking about what is the policy response necessary for a particular problem set, and what are the interventions needed that are being done through policy, and then what is the behavior change that's needed. And I've been thinking about it in the sense of Nila saying that she starts with problems. And this is a really big issue in development. A lot of development starts with solutions. There's a vague problem, but the good governance paradigm says we have the solution to any problem you have. We just mimic institutions and certain economic policies. There's been a shift. It has been called adaptive management, which really starts with a problem and then really iterative learning around what is the problem and how do you find the solution through participation and through engagement. And so I can almost see, and I'd love to hear Susan's thoughts, starting with the problem the way that Nila sets it up, engaging the behavior change wheel to say, how do we do better linking through this process of policy instruments leading to interventions and then assessing the behavior change, but then also introducing the bonding and bridging elements of social capital so that we're really focusing on linking, bridging, bonding, but in more problem-driven and adaptive ways. And I think this could get us, this would be the start of a discussion around how behavior change could meaningfully enter a broader development discourse in ways that are not just focused on the micro, but are linked to much more macro types of problems as well.
Yeah, if I could come in, I completely agree. And the World Health Organization have set up just recently, a few months ago, a new technical advisory group on behavioral insights. And one of the first things we're doing is producing a kind of a toolkit and a framework really to address, Jonathan, what you've been saying, is how do people in so many different contexts that the WHO are trying to support start with a problem and think about that problem in terms of behavior, in terms of the context, and kind of we're doing it as a journey, you know, that goes around until at the end, although there never is any end because you have to loop back in many iterative cycles, you're coming out with a solution. But what the steps are along the way and signposting to the kind of tools or frameworks like I mentioned, COMBI, capability, opportunity, motivation, behavior framework that sits in the middle of the behavior change wheel, but also others. We've got a theory of community empowerment, for example, which we'll bring in also. So I hope that will be out in a couple of months. And I really hope that this will be a very useful document for globally, because that's, we have 20 people from all over the world, and we're able to bring in the very different perspectives, the very different experience of different types of resources that people have to use in terms of trying to address problems. But I think the more we can bring this together and make it accessible to people, so people kind of can start with the problems that they are trying to solve and use the kind of tools or resources that are around in a kind of easy to manage way. So anyway, I hope we will be able to address, Jonathan, the points that you're raising there.
So the Victoria Forum has two things on its agenda, really. One is to bridge social divides, and I think what's been wonderful about this session is that we're bridging a lot of kind of disciplinary silos which have opened up a lot towards each other but have a long way to go, and it's been a fascinating conversation. So I hope we'll continue this conversation. The second part of the Victoria Forum is that one of the ideas behind every session is that some concrete recommendations might come out of it. And I want to wrap up our session by asking each of you, what is it that you would like to see happen on the basis of the conversation we've just had? And maybe we'll go in reverse order from we started. And I'll ask you first, Salim. What is a recommendation that you would like to give on the basis of the conversation today?
Sure. Thanks, Marika. So my recommendation would really be in terms of trying to incorporate a way where states could try to be better at anticipating and planning for risks and disasters that happen on an unforeseen basis. And one of the ways that can be done is by taking an outside view. So this is a way of being objective about creating objective comparisons between where you are compared to peers when it comes to facing a similar challenge. So for instance, when we look at COVID-19, a good way of taking an outside view is to kind of compare a country's capacity when it comes to key infrastructure and population dynamics and demographics to try to anticipate the possible effects that COVID-19 would have had on your country as the pandemic was spreading. And this is a really important perspective to take when it comes to especially preventing what we call a planning fallacy, a situation where you can become either overconfident in your ability to adequately address a potential crisis, or you're just grossly underprepared but don't realize it until it's too late. Yeah, and this would definitely require greater international collaboration and sharing of information. That would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Salim. A very good segue for Jonathan, I suspect, about greater international collaboration. Jonathan, what would your recommendation be?
So in the beginning, I sketched out the fact that fragile states are really the global center of crisis that we're dealing with as an aid community. And Canada makes fragile states a very prominent element of its international assistance policy. What's becoming increasingly clear is that the old models and ways of doing things are not fit for purpose as we move forward post-COVID. And so I would recommend that the Canadian Senate, which is a co-host of this forum, take up a study, whether it's through the Foreign Relations Committee or what have you, to really look at what are these new models and ways of working, this emerging fragility to resilience paradigm that we're seeing other major actors embracing. The United States has a newly approved piece of legislation called the Global Fragility Act that's mandating more adaptive and resilient approaches to fragile states. The European Union has come up with its strategic approach to resilience, which the Parliament has taken up as well. So I think this is a key moment for Canada to show leadership in terms of the new models, bringing in behavioral science and bringing in some of the other disciplines that we've been talking about, to really help sketch forward what's it going to look like, what's the next 10 years towards the SDGs going to look like for fragile states, and how can we do better?
Thank you. Nila, what are your thoughts? What would you like to recommend? I think we can't hear you. Sorry, Nila. I think... Yes.
I did the Zoom thing where I was muted. Yes, so I have two recommendations. One is to strengthen South-South networks. And I think there's a lot that can be learned just by global South countries really talking to each other. I learned this personally when we partnered with Busara to set up the Center for Social and Behavior Change, some of the work there, because we share common, things. And where I think the global north can take leadership, of course, is in funding this. This is important but not urgent. It always gets left out, and then these networks don't develop except very informally. And also providing expertise, about how these networks might best operate. But I think putting their weight behind global South networks. And the second idea is to think about very ambitiously how we can disseminate the ideas of behavioral science and seed them into these countries, and then let people take over with their culture and their experience and their lived experience. There just isn't enough of seeding of the behavioral science. It's incredibly hard for someone from India or from Kenya, if they want to learn about behavioral science, to even get started, even in a day when we have technology and the internet. So I would really push the Canadian government with their excellent institutions to think about how might we spread this in a way that's scalable and that can reach the population. So those are my two big asks.
Thank you, Nila. Susan, what are you?
A lot to add to. I was very struck by a comment Salim made, which is so true and so important, that the majority of research that's done in the world is basically in the United States. The majority of need for evidence as to what works and how to deliver things is in the global South. there's an incredible mismatch between those two things. And a project that I'm leading called the Human Behaviour Change Project is a collaboration between behavioural science and computer science to look at the world literature at scale and be able to draw out what we know to be useful and usable to what we don't know in under-researched areas. So anyway, I completely agree. This is a big issue. This is only one way of trying to address that. But the other issue that I wanted to raise, again, in terms of research, because we need more evidence, we need more knowledge as to what works, for whom, in what settings, for how long, etc., is that certainly in the UK, and I think this is repeated across the world, is if you look at where that research investment is, it's overwhelmingly in the pharmaceutical industry. So in the UK, we've had a research done which shows that, and just try and think about, you've got pharmaceuticals, okay, that's medicines and vaccines, but then you've got all of the behavioural interventions, the environmental interventions, the social interventions, the systems interventions. I only touched on them. And just do a little thought experiment. What percentage would you say of the research budget goes to the pharmaceutical industry, and what goes to all the rest of it, which is our only way out of these pandemics, and also how we prepare ourselves against the future pandemic? Well, the answer is around 4% for all the behavioural, environmental, social and systems intervention, 96% for pharmaceuticals. So I would say to whatever government is listening, it's not just about solving this pandemic and getting out of this pandemic. It's about preparing ourselves for the future pandemics to make societies more resilient so that we're never, blown off course and have so many people suffer so much as has happened in this pandemic. And that does require both readjusting society. So societies are more resilient, which does include redistribution of resources, but also generating the kind of evidence that's going to be useful to those parts of the world, and also those types of intervention that's really going to be the most important for making the world resilient. Because this has shown us, like nothing else, that no person, no community and no country is an island. We're interconnected and we all depend on each other.
Thank you. I really want to thank Susan Mishi, Jonathan Popalitis, Nila Saldana and Salim Kombo for a fascinating conversation which had as its purpose the idea to bring behavioral science into a conversation on bridging social divides and improving social relations, but also really thinking through ways of engaging on an international scale and between humans. And I take away a lot from this conversation, always the need to talk further to each other, which I'm looking forward to, but also just the importance that all of you have stressed in one way to another, to think about everything we do from the starting point of who we are as humans, where we are, in what circumstances we find ourselves, and how we can deal with them, and what we can do to support each other. And behavioral science can go a long way to support that. So thank you for all of you for your contribution. Thank you for all of you who joined us. And thank you so much to the Victoria Forum for hosting us. Thank you. Have a good day in Canada, a good night in Europe and Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.